any of us, indeed all of us, can slow or reverse the effects of aging. Aging is not the normal and natural consequence that we all will suffer, but rather that aging is a disease that can be slowed or halted. And you're going to learn both the mechanistic science behind aging, the mechanistic science behind reversing the aging process, and practical tools that you can apply in your everyday life.
Aging is 80 to 90% the cause of heart disease, Alzheimer's. If we didn't get old and our bodies stayed youthful, we would not get those diseases. And actually what we're showing in my lab is if you turn the clock back in tissues, those diseases go away. So aging is the problem. And instead, through most of the last 200 years, we've been sticking Band-Aids on diseases that have already occurred because of aging, and then it's too late. So there are a couple of things. One is we want to slow aging down so we don't get those diseases. And when they do occur, don't just stick a Band-Aid on, reverse the age of the body, and then the diseases will go away.
Why is it that having elevated blood sugar, glucose, and insulin ages us more quickly? And/or why is it that having periods of time each day, or perhaps longer, can extend our lifespan?
If you have low levels of insulin and another molecule called insulin-like growth factor, those low levels turn on the longevity genes. One of them that's really important is called SIRT1. But by having high levels of insulin all day, being fed means your longevity genes are not switched on. So you're falling apart, your epigenome, your information that keeps your cells functioning over time just degrades quicker. Your clock is ticking faster by always being fed. The other thing that I think might be happening by always having food around is that it's not allowing the cell to have periods of rest and reestablish the epigenome. And so it also is accelerating in that direction. There's plenty of other reasons as well that are not as profound, such as having low levels of glucose in your body will trigger your major muscles and your brain to become more sensitive to insulin and suck the glucose out of your bloodstream, which is very good. You don't want to have glucose flowing around too much. And that will ward off type 2 diabetes.
Do you think there's anything about the subjective experience of hunger itself that could be beneficial for longevity?
Yeah, I do, though you get used to the feeling of not eating. So I'm kind of screwed that way.
It's like cold water. You eventually adapt.
You get used to it, unfortunately. But there are some studies that are being done at the National Institutes of Health that are able to simulate the effect of hunger, but still provide the calories. And it's looking like there's a small component that's due to hunger. But most of it actually is because you've got these periods of not being fed, and then the body turns on these defensive genes. There's a really interesting experiment that was published maybe a couple of years ago by Rafael De Cabo down at the NIH. What he did was he took over 10,000 mice and gave them different combinations of fat, carbohydrate, protein, and he was trying to figure out what was the best combination. And then he also cleverly had two groups, one that was fed all the time or ate as much as they wanted, and the other group was only given food for an hour a day. And it turns out they ate roughly the same amount of calories because, of course, in an hour, they're stuffing their faces. It turns out it didn't matter what diet he gave them. It was only the group that ate within that window that lived longer and dramatically longer. So my conclusion is, and mice are very similar to us metabolically, I think that tells us that it's not as important what you eat, it's when you eat during the day.
What do you do, and what do you think is a good jumping off place if people want to explore this as a protocol?
Well, if there's one thing I would say definitely try to skip a meal a day. That's the best thing.
Does it matter which meal, or are they essentially equivalent?
Well, as long as it's at the end or the beginning of the day, because then you add that to the sleep period where you're hopefully not eating. Well, I'll tell you what I do. I skip breakfast. I have a tiny bit of yogurt or olive oil because the supplements I have need to be dissolved in it. And then I go throughout the whole day, as I'm doing right now here with this glass of water here. I'm just keeping myself filled with liquids, and so I don't feel hungry. Beware that the first 2 to 3 weeks when you try that, you will feel hungry, and you also have a habit of wanting to chew on something. There's a lot of physical parts to it, but try to make it through the first 3 weeks and do without breakfast or do without dinner, and you'll get through it. And I did that for most of my life, actually, mainly because I wasn't hungry in the morning. Some people are very hungry in the morning, and they may want to consider skipping dinner instead. But I will go throughout the whole day. I don't get the crashes of the high glucose and the low glucose. Anyone who goes, oh man, it's 3 o'clock, I'm going to need a sleep. If you do what I do, you will not experience that anymore. Because what my body does is it regulates blood sugar levels naturally. My liver is putting out glucose when it needs to, and it's very steady and gives me pure focus throughout the day. And I don't even have to think about lunch. I'm just powering through. I rarely eat dessert. I gave up dessert and sugar when I turned 40. And occasionally I'll steal a bit of dessert because it doesn't hurt if you steal it, right? But other than that, I avoid sugar, which includes simple carbohydrates, bread I try to avoid. I've actually noticed, this is just a side note, I used to get buildup of plaque pretty easily. And every time I went to the dentist, they'd have to scrape it off. And I even bought tools to scrape it off because it was driving me nuts. I don't get plaque anymore. And I think it's because of my diet. I don't have those sugars in my mouth that the bacteria feed on and then form the biofilm on the teeth.
You're eating more or less on it sounds like a 20 hours of fasting, 4 hours of eating, or 16 hours of fasting and 8 hours of food intake, et cetera. But do you ever do longer fasts, like 48 hours or 72 hours or week-long fasts?
Occasionally I do. So my typical day, I would only eat within a 2-hour window. Just usually I'm either eating out or...
So you're 22-2.
Yeah.
And if you exercise, do you feel like then you just power through and maintain that fasted state?
Absolutely. I can exercise, and now my body's so used to it, I don't feel like I need food after exercising. I used to. But have I gone longer? Yes, but not very often. I find it quite difficult to go more than 24 hours. But when I do it, maybe it's once a month, I'll go for 2 days. After 2, and actually even better if you go for 3 days without eating, it kicks in even greater longevity benefits. If I could go longer, I would, but I just find that with my lifestyle, and I'm going always day, 110%, I need to eat at least once a day, unfortunately.